They talk about the moment you lose someone, but no one talks about what happens after everyone else goes home, after the phone stops ringing, after the shock wears off, and you're left alone with the silence. October 22nd, 2021, Cleveland, Ohio. My name is Mark, and that was the morning my phone rang at 6:13 a.m., a sound so ordinary it shouldn't have meant anything, except something in my chest tightened before I even reached for it. I already knew. I don't know how I knew, but I did. When my sister's name showed up on the screen that early, my body reacted before my mind could catch up, and by the time I answered, I was already holding my breath. Her voice came through broken and uneven, like she was trying to speak through water, and at first I couldn't understand her words, only the panic underneath them. Then she said it. Dad is gone, just like that. No build-up, no warning, gone. She said it was a heart attack in his sleep, that it was fast, that he didn't suffer, that he probably didn't even know it was happening. But those details didn't soften anything. They just floated around the room while I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the wall, waiting for something inside me to react. People talk about grief like it's loud and dramatic, like collapsing to the floor or screaming into the air, but mine arrived quietly, like someone turned the volume down on the world without asking. I felt numb, detached, like I was watching someone else as life unfold, and didn't know when I'd be allowed back into my own. I remember thinking, this can't be real yet, because it didn't feel real, and part of me believed it wouldn't be real until I saw him, until someone else said it again, until there was proof that this wasn't some mistake that would be corrected in a few minutes. I showered, got dressed, and moved through the morning like a machine. Every action automatic, every thought slow and heavy. I drove to my parents' house on autopilot, passing streets. I'd driven 1,000 times, stopping at red lights, watching people go about their normal routines. And that's when the first wave of grief hit me, not as sadness, but as disbelief. The world was still functioning. Coffee shops were opening. Cars were honking. People were laughing on sidewalks. My father had just died, and nothing around me seemed to care. When I walked into the house, it smelled the same, looked the same, felt the same, and yet everything was different. Family members were already there, neighbors, people I recognized and people I didn't, all speaking in soft voices, hugging each other tightly, crying openly. I stood near the doorway, unsure of where to go, unsure of who I was supposed to be now. Someone handed me a cup of coffee I didn't drink. Someone hugged me and said how sorry they were. I nodded and thanked them because grief has rules, and one of the first rules is to be polite even when your chest feels hollow. I walked into my dad's bedroom and stared at the bed where he'd slept for years, the place where his life ended quietly, while the rest of us were still dreaming, and I felt this strange mix of comfort and anger. Comfort because it looked peaceful, anger because it looked untouched, like he could walk back in at any moment. People say the funeral is the hardest part of loss, but no one tells you how surreal it feels to sit in a room full of people talking about someone you love in the past tense, while your brain refuses to accept that tense at all. At the service, they shared stories about who he was, his work ethic, his humor, the way he showed up for everyone, how proud he was of his family. And I listened like they were describing a character from a story I used to know. People watched me closely, waiting for me to break, and when I didn't, they told me I was strong, like strength is measured by how well you hide your grief. What they didn't know was that I hadn't cried yet because my body hadn't caught up with my reality. I shook hands, accepted condolences, stood next to the casket feeling disconnected from my own reflection, and wondered when the pain everyone promised would come was going to arrive. After the funeral, the house filled with food, casseroles stacked in the fridge, plates on every surface, and for a few days there was always noise, always movement, always someone asking if I needed anything. My phone buzzed constantly with messages checking in, offering support, reminding me I wasn't alone, and I answered them all with the same sentence, "I'm okay," because that felt easier than trying to explain something I didn't understand yet. Grief during those first days felt like being carried by other people, like I was floating above the pain instead of inside it. But grief is patient. It waits. Slowly, politely, life moved on. People went back to work. Visits became shorter. Messages slowed down. The house got quieter. The chairs were folded and put away, and that's the part no one talks about. The moment when the support fades, but the grief doesn't. I went back to work because routine felt safer than sitting alone with my thoughts. And everyone assumed I was doing better because I showed up, because I smiled, because I answered emails and attended meetings. But grief doesn't disappear just because you're functioning. It just changes shape. It becomes quieter, heavier, more personal. I'd reach for my phone to call my dad about something small, a question about my car, advice about a decision, a joke I knew he'd appreciate, and I'd stop halfway through unlocking the screen when I remembered there was no one on the other end anymore. That moment happened again and again, like my brain needed repetition to accept the loss. At the grocery store, I'd see his favorite cereal and feel my throat tighten for no reason I could explain. A song he used to hum would come on the radio, and suddenly my chest felt too tight to breathe. No one tells you that grief can show up weeks later when you think you're redoing okay, or months later when everyone else expects you to have moved on. Nights were the hardest. During the day there were distractions, responsibilities, conversations, but at night the absence got louder. I'd sit on the couch staring at the television without knowing what I was watching, or lie in bed listening to the house settle, replaying memories I didn't ask for. I started realizing how many parts of my life were tied to him, how many decisions I'd made with his guidance, how many habits were shaped by his presence, and that's when the grief deepened. Because grief isn't just missing someone. It's losing the version of yourself that existed when they were alive. People asked how I was doing, and I said I was okay, because explaining felt too heavy, because I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable, because I didn't know how to put this kind of emotional pain into words. There's a loneliness in grief that doesn't come from being alone, but from feeling unseen. You can be surrounded by people and still feel like you're carrying something no one else can touch. I started sitting in my car after work with the engine off, just breathing, because going home felt like admitting he wasn't there. I avoided certain rooms in the house because everything still felt like him, his tools exactly where he left them, his jacket still hanging by the door, like he might come back for it. I felt guilty when I laughed, guilty when I didn't cry, guilty when time passed and the pain didn't look the way people expected it to. I replayed our last conversation over and over, wondering if I said enough, if I showed enough, if I missed something important. Grief brought questions with no answers and left them sitting in my chest. Holidays came and went, each one heavier than the last, each one reminding me of an empty space that couldn't be filled. I learned that grief doesn't follow a straight line. Some days felt manageable, almost normal, and then a random moment would knock the air out of me. This is the part of grief no one talks about. The quiet part, the long part. The part where there's no ceremony, no sympathy cards, no one checking in anymore. Just you and the loss learning how to exist together. And this was only the beginning. No one warns you that after the shock fades, grief doesn't disappear. It settles in. It becomes something you wake up with and go to sleep with. Something that follows you quietly through ordinary days. After the funeral, after the calls slowed down, after people stopped asking how I was holding up, life expected me to return to normal, even though nothing inside me felt normal anymore. I went back to work because staying busy felt safer than sitting alone with my thoughts, and everyone around me took that as proof that I was healing. They said things like, "You're doing so well, you're handling this better than most people," and I nodded because correcting them felt like too much effort. What they didn't see was how often I stared at my computer screen without processing a single word, how grief blurred my concentration and made even simple tasks feel exhausting. I learned quickly how to function on autopilot, how to smile at the right moments, how to respond with "I'm okay" when someone asked how I was doing, even though that answer felt less true every day. Grief became quieter, but heavier, like a weight I carried everywhere without ever setting down. It showed up in small, unexpected ways. I'd hear a laugh that sounded like his and feel my chest tighten. I'd catch myself reaching for my phone to tell him something trivial, something he wouldn't even remember 5 minutes later, and the realization that I couldn't do that anymore hit me fresh every time. That repetition was brutal, like losing him over and over again in small moments spread across days and weeks. Nights were worse than I expected. During the day there were distractions, meetings, conversations, noise, but at night the silence felt intentional, like it was pressing in on me. I lay in bed replaying memories I didn't ask for, conversations that ended too soon, moments I took for granted when I assumed there would always be more time. I started questioning everything, wondering if I called enough, if I listened enough, if I showed him how much he mattered while he was still here. Grief has a way of rewriting the past, of turning ordinary moments into missed opportunities and unanswered questions. One avoided certain places because they reminded me too much of him. His favorite restaurant, the hardware store we used to visit together, even streets I associated with conversations we once had. Other times I went out of my way to be near those places, like proximity could somehow keep him close. I didn't understand why some days felt almost okay while others felt unbearable, why grief came in waves instead of fading gradually, like people implied it would. I learned that grief doesn't move forward in a straight line. It circles back. It surprises you. It waits until you think you're steady before knocking the air out of you. People around me assumed the hardest part was over because enough time had passed. But time doesn't heal grief the way it heals wounds. It just teaches you how to live with the pain. I felt isolated in ways I couldn't explain, not because I was alone, but because no one else seemed to be standing in the same emotional space anymore. Friends talked about their plans, their frustrations, their normal problems, and I nodded along while feeling disconnected, like I was living in a parallel version of the same world. I noticed how grief changed the way I looked at time, how the future felt less certain, and the past felt heavier. Milestones I used to imagine now carried an ache because I knew he wouldn't be there to see them. Birthdays, holidays, random weekends, all of them felt incomplete. I learned that grief isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's dull and exhausting. Sometimes it's forgetting why you walked into a room. Sometimes it's staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m, wondering how the world keeps moving without someone who meant everything to you. I felt pressure to be okay, to show progress, to reassure people that I was healing, and that pressure made the grief lonelier. I stopped talking about him as much because I didn't want to make people uncomfortable, and in doing that, I felt like I was slowly erasing him from conversations, which hurt in a different way. Some nights I sat in my car after work, engine off, just breathing, because going home meant facing the absence again. The house felt too quiet, too still, like it was waiting for something that would never happen. I started realizing that grief isn't just emotional pain, it's physical too. It sits in your chest, tightens your throat, drains your energy, makes your body feel heavy even when nothing is wrong on the surface. I didn't recognize myself in the mirror some days, the tired eyes, the distant look, the version of me shaped by loss instead of possibility. I wondered if this was who I was now, if grief had permanently changed me, if healing meant becoming someone different rather than returning to who I used to be. People say you should focus on the good memories, but even the good memories hurt at first because they highlighted what I'd lost. Loving him meant grieving him, and there was no separating the two. I learned that grief doesn't ask permission. It shows up in meetings and conversations and moments when you least expect it. It doesn't care if you're busy or tired or trying to move on. It demands space even when you don't have any left to give. Healing wasn't something that would happen suddenly or visibly. It was something slow, uneven, and deeply personal. This was the middle of grief, the part after the shock, before acceptance, where the pain isn't new anymore but still hasn't softened. The part no one prepares you for. The part where you're expected to function while carrying a loss that still feels impossibly heavy. And I was still standing in it, learning day by day how to carry what couldn't be fixed. No one tells you that grief doesn't end. It settles. It doesn't stay sharp forever, but it never fully loosens its grip either. It becomes something you wake up with and go to sleep with, something that no longer shocks your system, but quietly reshapes it. Years pass, and people assume time has fixed everything, but time doesn't fix grief. It teaches you how to live with it. I realized this when someone asked me if I was finally over it, like grief was a phase I should have completed by now. I didn't know how to explain that nothing was wrong, but nothing was the same either. That's the part no one talks about. Long-term grief doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with sympathy cards or check-in messages. It shows up in small moments in ordinary days when you least expect it. It shows up when something good happens, and the first person you want to tell, ISN too there. It shows up when you realize you've started living a life they'll never know. At first, that realization felt unbearable. It felt like betrayal, like moving forward meant leaving them behind. I struggled with that guilt for a long time. Every moment of happiness came with a shadow. Every laugh felt followed by an apology I never said out loud. I didn't understand how people could talk about healing when the loss was permanent. I wasn't just grieving a person. I was grieving the version of myself that existed before everything changed. I was grieving the future I imagined, the conversations that would never happen, the advice I would never get, the moments they would never witness. Long-term grief is realizing that your life splits into before and after, and the after keeps going whether you're ready or not. I noticed how my identity slowly shifted. I wasn't the same person in rooms full of people anymore. I listened more than I spoke. I observed more than I participated. I felt older than my age, like I had crossed some invisible line that separated me from people who hadn't experienced this kind of loss yet. There was a loneliness in that, a quiet distance that words couldn't explain. Even when I was surrounded by others, I felt like I was carrying something they couldn't see or touch. Grief taught me that you can feel deeply alone without being physically alone. I stopped expecting people to understand, and in some ways that was freeing. I learned to protect my grief instead of trying to translate it. Over time, the pain changed texture. It wasn't the same crushing weight every day. Some days were light enough to forget for a moment. Other days felt heavier for no obvious reason. Anniversaries still carried a quiet gravity. Random dates on the calendar could pull me backward without warning. A smell, a song, a phrase they used to say could undo me in seconds. And yet, I kept living. That was the strange part. Life didn't pause just because I was grieving. Bills still needed to be paid. Work still demanded attention. Relationships still required effort. I learned how to function while grieving, how to smile without feeling dishonest, how to show up without falling apart. That didn't mean I was healed. It meant I was surviving in a world that didn't slow down for loss. Healing, I discovered, wasn't about returning to who I was before. That person no longer existed. Healing was about becoming someone new while carrying what I'd lost. That process was slow and uneven. Some days I felt proud of how far I'd come. Other days I felt like I was right back at the beginning. Long-term grief is cyclical. It doesn't move in straight lines. It revisits old wounds in new ways. But it also creates space for growth you never asked for. I became more patient with pain, both my own and other people's. I noticed suffering more easily. I paid attention in ways I hadn't before. Grief stripped away my illusions about control and permanence. It taught me that nothing is guaranteed, and because of that, everything matters more. I stopped postponing joy. I stopped assuming there would always be more time. At the same time, I learned to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to fix it. Grief taught me endurance. It taught me that some things can't be solved, only carried. There were moments when healing surprised me. Not big, dramatic breakthroughs, but quiet shifts. The first time I realized I'd gone an entire day without thinking about the loss constantly. The first time I spoke about them without my voice shaking. The first time I felt gratitude without immediately feeling pain. Those moments didn't erase the grief, but they softened its edges. I began to understand that healing wasn't the absence of grief, but the presence of life alongside it. I allowed myself to build routines again. I allowed myself to imagine a future, even though it looked different than I'd planned. I allowed myself to feel connected to others without comparing their presence to the absence I carried. That didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, in ways that only I could notice. Long-term grief also changed how I saw myself in the world. I became more honest about my limits. I stopped forcing myself to be strong for the sake of appearances. I learned that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but truth. I learned that it was okay to have days when the grief resurfaced unexpectedly. Those days didn't mean I was failing. They meant I was human. Over time, grief became less of an enemy and more of a companion. Not a welcome one, but a familiar one. Something that reminded me of how deeply I had loved. I stopped asking when it would end and started asking how I could live well with it. I found comfort in small rituals, returning to places that held memories, holding on to objects that carried meaning, speaking their name out loud even when no one else did. Those acts didn't keep me stuck. They kept me connected. Long-term grief taught me that love doesn't disappear when someone does. It transforms. It becomes memory, influence, presence, and absence. I saw how grief shaped my decisions, my values, my sense of empathy. I saw how it made me quieter but deeper, softer but stronger. I realized that healing didn't mean letting go of the pain completely. It meant letting go of the fear that the pain would destroy me. I learned that I could carry it and still build a meaningful life, that I could miss someone every day and still find purpose. That grief didn't disqualify me from joy. It refined it. And eventually I understood that this quiet, long-term grief was not something to escape. It was something to integrate. A reminder of love, of connection, of what it means to lose something that mattered. This is the part of grief no one talks about. The years after, the identity shift, the quiet healing that happens without applause or recognition, the slow learning of how to live fully while carrying an absence that never leaves. And if you're here, in this part of grief, still breathing, still showing up, still trying, then you're doing more than surviving. You're becoming someone who knows the weight of love and chooses to keep living anyway.